So a couple things to hit from the beginning. Number one, if 4 hours sounds like way too long at the Seriously Dating and Engaged group, that's your answer, break up. Because it's a lot more than 4 hours in marriage, just forewarning you now. Secondly, gosh, how about that prayer from the Spirit-filled little one? And then the girl's prayer was good too. I really enjoyed that. No, thanks, Dan. She really hammered home, right? Like the key to her prayer was that mothers would relax. Yes, I've been telling my mother that for 40 years. And now what I realize is I should have been praying. Mothers, relax. Today's conversation is going to be about all of us relaxing a little bit. And so that actually frames today's question that frames the rest of the conversation is where's my joy? Right? And I think what we're going to find is that perhaps from the mouth of babes, relaxing attaches to my joy far more than I would realize. If you don't have a Bible, raise your hand. The ushers will put one in your hand. They're going to put one in my hand because I realized that I brought one that's a different, actually a different translation. Thank you. We've been in the book of Luke, and I like that one word can actually make all of you go to some place. It's kind of phenomenal. I'm not your father. So we've been in the book of Luke. Last week we were looking at chapter 13 of the conversation. Pete, bless you. And the crooked shall be made straight. Thank you. Last week we were in chapter 13, and we were really having a conversation of kingdom, and one of the themes of Luke throughout the book has been kingdom, God's kingdom crashing in on us, and what does that look like? And as we looked at chapter 13, we saw that the kingdom, it entails a couple things, but one of it is initially our own repentance, but as we then step in, what is the fruits of the kingdom? And one of the first fruits is actually joining the kingdom work. Right? It's joining what God is already doing. So we looked at the crippled woman, crippled by this demonic influence and the engagement of bringing her back into conversation. And really, in some ways, one of the questions that was posed was, where are we in the work? Right? As the kingdom moves forward, what part are we playing in the kingdom? And so then, because we at Rock Harbor are overachievers, we skipped chapter 14 entirely. We're going into chapter 15, and we're going to cover all of chapter 15. And because I am short-winded and very, very brief with my words, we give me full chapters. So 2 hours from now, moms, you'll get your kids back. What I want you to do, actually, is I want you to think about what was the last thing that you lost that you were actually glad you found? We lose plenty of things that we don't care about. What was the last thing you lost that you were glad you found? Have you identified something in your head? Some of you, you're thinking back to 3 minutes ago, and you realized your phone is under your seat, and when you heard I was speaking, you were like, thank God I have this. Others of you, you're thinking back a year or two. Now, tell somebody next to you, what was it? Something you lost, you're glad you found it. Somebody give me one. What'd you lose? Other than your dignity and pride. What'd you lose?
Glasses.
Glasses?
The remote control.
Remote control.
That's my babysitter sometimes.
Ooh, the digital babysitter, yes.
My diamond in my wedding ring.
Diamond in your wedding ring. Okay. How happy were you when you found your glasses?
See you again.
Yes. Seeing is important. How happy were you when you found your diamond? Right? but most important, how happy were you when you found the electronic babysitter? Yes, right? And we celebrate. Today's passage is going to look at this issue of lost and found. It's going to be 3 different parables of lost and found. And there's always a little bit of fear and trepidation for me when we're in passages that are rather common, like rather well known. So we'll see how that lands. But again, think about where is my joy and how does that connect to this sense of lost and found. So we're in chapter 15. We'll look at the first 2 verses. Now the tax collectors and sinners were all gathering around to hear Jesus. But the Pharisees and the teachers of the law muttered, "This man welcomes sinners and eats with them." It feels important to me that you have a good visual of what's occurring here. So I'm going to need, I need Daniel, for sure. Come on up. Daniel is obviously, right, who is Daniel in this story? Come on, guys. Strapping, beautiful. We all know that Jesus was a vision and array of masculinity. But the long hair will do. So Jesus he is. I need sinners. So Steve, come on down. Yeah, that's good. Steve, you can represent sinners for all. None of you don't know what I'm talking about, just have him tell you about his trips around Europe as a young man. And or the rude things that he says about me today. So here's my sinner, and then I need the pharisaical world, right? So, I mean, obviously. We don't need to say the name, right? I mean, did you notice that he just sort of walks forward? So that'll be great.
I don't know if I need to be like up here.
Interesting, above Jesus, yes. Well, so let's have Jesus teaching. Steve, I'm not going to... Yeah, stand up. Just step up one. There you go. Steve, come here. Steve, come on. For those of you who don't know, Steve's been gone for 2 weeks, traveling Africa and the Middle East, and we're glad to have him back.
No big deal.
So again, probably sinner. So come here. Come here. What I actually want you to do is basically just kind of kneel. You can't really recline. It would normally be like laying out and eating, right? But there you go. That's perfect. So here's Steve, and then
Going in a good direction.
and can you actually come this side and do exactly what you're doing?
Okay.
Yes. Yeah, the normal Jeff Sherrod approach is perfect. Yes, method acting is what we have here. So this is the context for this entire passage, right? Jesus is interacting and engaging with, teaching with, sitting with, actually eating with the sinners. The destitute, the low, the spiritually poor, the worthless of society. To be very clear, this is one of my good friends. I would not be this rude to a normal stranger. He's sitting with the sinners, and the Pharisees are saying, they're not saying, they're murmuring, they're grumbling. Right? They're standing at the side. Yes, thank you. Frog murmur. I appreciate that. They're literally muttering amongst themselves. This man welcomes sinners and eats with them. And when you take welcomes and eats, right? What you're doing in the Greek, there's a commentary that says these 2 words would form the combination of what would generally be the context of fellowship. This is not Jesus, the distant teacher with the sinners. This is Jesus fellowshipping with the group of society that the Pharisees reject. Right? Does that make sense? What? Well, he would. He'd be on the floor with them, actually, yeah. But then nobody can see them, and then the point of a visual isn't really a visual. Thank you, honey. I appreciate that. Yeah, this is fellowshipping. And so the Pharisees here are murmuring to each other. They're muttering to each other. They're grumbling to each other. Now, if you just let your brain... We actually have far more knowledge than we realize. I would like to encourage you in that. For some of you, your brain may have actually gone there. Have you ever heard in Scripture, any context of muttering and grumbling before? Right? Do any specific ones come to mind? Exodus. Right? They come out, they cross the Red Sea, and then we hit Exodus let's see, what is it? 16, 2. And we immediately get a very significant change of conversation. Yes, you guys are just stuck right there, by the way. Thanks. I appreciate that. In 2, let's see, 16. In the desert, the whole community grumbled. They murmured against Moses and Aaron. The Israelites said to them, "If only we had died by the Lord's hand in Egypt. There we sat around pots of meat and ate all the food we wanted. But you have brought us into this desert to starve this entire assembly to death." And then further down in verse 7, "In the morning you will see the glory of the Lord, because he has heard your muttering, your grumble against him." "And who are we that you should grumble against us?" Moses said. "You will know that it was the Lord when he gives you meat to eat in the evening and all the bread you want in the morning, because he has heard your grumbling against him. Who are we? You are not grumbling against us, but against the Lord." So this is the setting for 3 parables we're going to step into. Jesus in fellowship with the low, the poor, the destitute of society, the Pharisees, the leaders, the religious leaders, muttering to one another, right? And the echo that you should hear from Luke is this same terminology, this point back. This is what Israel has done forever. They mutter against the Lord. Each time it's not enough. Each way he does it, it doesn't land, right? And so the Pharisees continue. Keep in mind, we're not going to throw the Pharisees out. It is their call, their duty to ensure the religious sanctity of Israel. So on the one hand, they're playing out their role. On the other hand, they're playing out their role improperly. They're missing something significant, right? This is our setting. Guys, you're amazing. Thank you. There are callbacks. Be prepared. Be prepared. So it's in response to this muttering that Jesus says to them this parable. Starting verse 3. He told them this parable. "Suppose one of you has 100 sheep and loses one of them. Doesn't he leave the 99 in the open country and go after the lost sheep until he finds it? When he finds it, he joyfully puts it on his shoulders and goes home. And then he calls his friends and neighbors together and says, 'Rejoice with me, I have found my lost sheep.' I tell you that in the same way there will be more rejoicing in heaven over one sinner who repents than over 99 righteous persons who do not need to repent." The parable of the shepherd. Sean, do you have there it is. James Tissot was a painter in the 19th century. This is his rendition of this story. It hangs in the Brooklyn Museum. The things I want you to notice first off are the rough stones, the rough rock, the rough terrain, right? It's difficult. This parable is talking about the shepherd going out into a dangerous situation, a dangerous reality to find the one, right? And in our American and human logic, it defies understanding because we're a cut your loss, right, and insulate the mass you still have kind of personality. If I have 99 and I've lost one, what is the hazards of shepherding? That every now and then you're going to lose one. But do you put the 99 at risk to go find the one? It doesn't make logical sense. And so there's a certain rejection against this, and yet at the same time there is this sense of, he goes out, he finds it. By the way, sheep are smart or not smart? Not smart, yes. Yes. On the brightness scale, they're about almost half a candle, right? In a very, very dark place from 100 yards away. They are not smart animals. So their nature is such that when they get lost, and ponder this for yourself, when they get lost, they freak out. And when they freak out, they don't know how to return. So for the sheep to be added back to the flock, that will not happen on their own accord. The shepherd has to go find them. Does that make sense? There's a paralysis reality there. They don't know what to do. That might speak to the human condition more than we think about. So in this parable, 99, 1, okay, he goes, he gets the sheep, he brings it back, and what does he do? What does he do? He rejoices. Might I suggest that we struggle with rejoicing a little bit? Because if you're like me, when I read that, I'm like, well, he went, he did his work, he got his one, he goes home, and he puts his feet up and says, ugh, what a long day. Why is he rejoicing? Isn't it his job? What is he rejoicing about? Because I'm more ticked off that the sheep's not doing what it's supposed to do than I am happy that I had to go out, did find it, and came back. And certainly I'm not inviting a bunch of people in to have a conversation about how I lost one of my sheep to begin with. He rejoices. And he doesn't rejoice privately, he rejoices publicly. Now Jesus could have just stopped there. He's already making a statement to the Pharisees about who God is. God is the shepherd. Again, Jewish audience, they're going to hear echoes of Ezekiel 34. When God, looking at his priests, scribes, leaders, says, no longer do you lead my people. I myself will go find my sheep. I myself will provide for them. I myself. His audience, in this case the Pharisees and the scribes, they know their scriptures well. So when he says this is what the shepherd does, they're going to hear that echo. That would have been more than enough. But he moves on to this next parable. And he says, or suppose a woman has 10 silver coins and loses one. Doesn't she light a lamp, sweep the house, and search carefully until she finds it? And when she finds it, she calls her friends and neighbors together and says, rejoice with me. I've found my lost coin. In the same way, I tell you, there is rejoicing in the presence of the angels of God over one sinner who repents. So we have this second parable, and there's some really interesting things about this parable. Number one is the fact that Jesus uses a woman. Right? Happy Mother's Day. We're talking in a culture where women had a certain lesser value as far as the understanding of the roles they play and the ways that they would be used in this text. This is a culture that puts male headship well above, from a value standpoint even. And Jesus, as he has done throughout his ministry, he just digs at that every now and then to say, no, that's not the kingdom that I'm talking about. And he brings this beautiful sense of value and connection to being a woman in that society. He does it in a number of ways. There are women that are traveling with him, which is interesting, right? Because we don't read a lot about that in the text, but there's a couple little moments to say these people are part of that, if you will, entourage. They're helping financially support and engage the ministry that is occurring. They're with him in that. But he also does it by using things that wouldn't make sense in some ways to the Pharisees. There's no need to use a woman. Why not just a guy who lost his coins? And I think the statement is, no, we've talked about the shepherd, the man at work. Let's talk about the woman at home for a second. Let's create some equality here that you wouldn't naturally feel. So to this audience, this would again be provocative. This would be a bit of a push. Now, if we have... Oh, it's so dark. It's perfect. This is Dominic Fetti. He's a painter, 17th century Italian painter, and this is his rendition of the woman finding the coin. You're talking about a very poor woman in kind of a clay hovel. Think no windows. So part of what doesn't make sense to us is that we've got light everywhere. So if I drop a coin, kick on every light you can find, pull out my iPhone and use the flashlight thing, and there it is, and I move on. But in a dark clay house with a single candle, shadows, have you ever dropped something that's similar to the floor that you're standing on? And you're like standing right over it and you can't see it, and you have to get down on your hands and knees and work around until you're like, yep, there that is. That's what's happening for her. She's searching throughout. Now, why is she searching? This is one of 10 coins. Note the progression. We went one of 99. Now we're going one of 10. It's more important. And it's more important in this way. 10, a drachma, like a silver coin, would be basically the equivalent of a day's wage. For a very poor family, they wouldn't have coins or wouldn't have many. This would be like their life savings. The 10 coins that they have on top of, what they have of physical, tangible kind of goods. This would be their life savings. So 1/10 of all they have as far as their wealth, if you will, as far as what protects them, has been lost. And so she gets down on her hands and knees, right? She scrubs the floor. She looks at every nook and cranny until she finds it. And then when she finds it, what does she do? Rejoices. How? She celebrates with people publicly. Now, there's one astute theologian who actually had a student that voiced it. Does this mean that she actually probably spent more in her celebration than she had in what she found? And that might actually be the point of this parable, interestingly enough. Right? Like it's an oddity. It's an oddity that, pardon me a second. There we go. It's an oddity that she takes the time to find this thing that matters so much and then generously celebrates and engages. And it would seem that the point there is that we're looking again at a God who efficiency is not the standard, right? Who lavishly engages and supplies. When he finds, he lavishly engages. And so it's counterintuitive, and yet we're seeing something here. We have a God who puts the whole, if you will, to the side while he seeks one to then add it back in and then celebrates publicly. We have a God who looks through every nook and cranny for what is lost. And when found, right, the point was not in hoarding or keeping the value. The point was in the finding to begin with, and therefore celebrates and engages that what was lost isn't. And then we get to the third one. And this is the one that we all know pretty darn well. You'll know it as the parable of the prodigal son, the parable of the lost son. My wife was one of the first who pointed this out to me, and now I've read through a bunch of commentators who say the same thing. It's interesting that we have turned these three parables into making the thing that is lost the point, when in reality, the main point seems to be the seeker. Right? The first two parables, the items don't seek to come back. The only thing that's occurring is that someone goes and finds them. This third one, it's possible that the same thing is occurring, so keep that in mind. If you were to call this the parable of the good father, it might reframe some conversation, but let's read through it, and then we'll fast track this thing home. Jesus continued, "There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger one said to his father, 'Father, give me my share of the estate.' So he divided his property between them. Not long after that, the younger son got together all he had, set off for a distant country, and there squandered his wealth in wild living. After he had spent everything, there was a severe famine in the whole country, and he began to be in need. So he went, hired himself out to a citizen of that country who sent him to his fields to feed pigs. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. When he came to his senses, he said, 'How many of my father's hired servants have food to spare? And here I am starving to death. I'll set out and go back to my father and say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants.' So he got up and went to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him, and he was filled with compassion for him. And he ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. The son said to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son.' But the father said to his servants, 'Quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate, for this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.' And so they began to celebrate. Meanwhile, the older son was in the field. When he came near the house, he heard music and dancing. So he called one of the servants and asked him, "What was going on?" "Your brother has come," he replied, "and your father has killed the fattened calf because he has him back safe and sound." The older brother became angry, refused to go in. So his father went out and pleaded with him. But he answered his father, "Look, all these years I've been slaving for you and never disobeyed your orders, yet you never gave me even a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours, who has squandered your property with prostitutes, comes home, you kill the fattened calf for him." "My son," the father said, "you are always with me. Everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and be glad because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found." Sean, if you can put up the third one, which is also incredibly dark. That is so sad. It almost works, though. This is Rembrandt, The Return of the Prodigal. And what you see is the son kneeling, the father, his hands stretched over him, and you can just barely see the face up in the upper right of the older son, kind of taking it all in. What's interesting to me is that Jesus uses these three parables, and he does it in progression. Well, what about 1 out of 99 for just typical work? Okay, well, what about 1 out of 10, where you're talking more about life savings? What about 1 out of 2 when you're talking about humanity? Right? His context, remember, is the Pharisees. His context is the Pharisees looking back, standing to the side, murmuring and grumbling over what he's doing as he interacts with these people. And so he's built a progression for them to say, you'd celebrate here, you'd celebrate here. Would you celebrate here? And man, there's so many pieces that come up from this. A couple things in the story, right? The son has rejected the family. He would normally be, he would be owed, if you will, when dad passes, he'd be owed 1/3 of the estate. The older son would be owed 2/3 of the estate, both for himself and to take care of the other members of the family with that estate. So what he's asking for is that 1/3 now. What he's saying is, Dad, I'm out. No thanks. I'm done with you. And note that when he says that, what is he also saying about his brother? His older brother. I'm done with you as well. He's rejecting family. Right? It's utter and complete rejection. And culturally, while we don't have this same familial weight, if you will, think about it, family is safety and proximity. You wanted as many sons as you could have because that ensured that people who were attacking you would have a harder time. Family is safety culturally. So to reject family, it has so many implications in this moment. So he takes his money and he bails. There's two sides of this equation. So one is recognize how often our own desires, the things we think make us enough, the things that we're looking for to determine identity and worth, draw us away from the things we've actually been given already. How many of us have been in that place and position? We've been given goodness, engagement, but it's not enough. And so we look towards, our desires drive us forward towards some other thing that we will identify ourselves by. So that's a pretty common story. And then what you see is he lands at the lowest point possible in his life, to be feeding pigs, which is a dirty animal to Israel, to Jewish culture, to not have enough, to be stuck in a famine. The severity of this low point is actually his turning point. It's interesting the way God uses suffering often to bring clarity. And in his situation, that's what's occurring. He finally looks at his life and says, wait a minute, I had a very different existence. Maybe there's a way to go back to that. But he does not go back to that in fullness, does he? He goes back in a manner that says, Dad's servants, they have it okay. They're provided for. I need to go back in a place like a servant and simply regain provision. because it's not for me to take back the place that I rejected. So that's the younger son. On the other side is the older son. Now he's been rejected, the same way the father's been rejected. He has a right, if you will, to have anger. But he's standing there, and in his resentment, right? What you see is he's actually denying his own relationship with his father. And fascinating to me. What is it that the prodigal did? He denied his father and went his own way. The prodigal comes back, the father receives him, and we'll talk more about the father in a second. The father receives him, the son comes and says, wait, what's going on? Well, the father has received your brother who rejected you, and the older brother says, oh, well, forget you. I don't want that. That's not fair, it's not right. It doesn't align with my principles of what is there. And so now the older son is the prodigal. You could call this the parable of the two prodigals. Right? The first prodigal gets a lot of bad rap. What's wrong with you? You went out and ran around. But in reality, they're both prodigals because they're both pushing away from the Father's love, from what the Father is inviting them into, from what's there. They're just doing it for different reasons. One is trying to find himself and identify himself through all the ways that everything else in life might identify him. And one is trying to identify himself by not doing what he did. Through his own self-righteousness, through his own work, through his own effort, through doing it correct. And neither one of them is understanding the Father's heart in the moment. And so in the third parable, what's interesting is, you know who the seeker is? It's still the Father. The lost does come back, but without the Father saying, I've been looking for you internally. I've been awaiting you. I've been wanting to put my hands over you and invite you back in. That initial prodigal son would have no place. It's still the Father. And he's still seeking because when the son comes and he finds out the older son and he finds out what's going on, he says, whoa, I don't want anything to do with that. The Father goes to him. His posture is still the seeking posture, and he goes to the older son. He says, come in the house. And then, it's kind of crazy. When you look at the wording, he creates a mutuality with the older son. He says, look, all that I have is yours. I put you on equal footing with me. What do I have to do to get you to celebrate? To get you to understand what my heart is. My heart is that we, as a family, would simply be family. That all the crap that occurs in that would not be defining. What do I have to do to get you to see that piece and to join me? You've been with me every year that he's been gone, and yet somehow your heart is not my heart. And he could leave him there. He could have left the first one there. Your heart was not my heart, you left. And he could have left the second one here. Your heart's not my heart because you won't forgive. But he doesn't. He invites both of them back in. Come back to the house. How can we not celebrate what was lost? That's the Father. And so now let's reframe it back to the question, where is my joy? To which, if you're like me, your brain might be on, what? But where is my joy? These three parables are all about when the lost is found, we celebrate. We celebrate. We celebrate. The kingdom of heaven celebrates. It invites. It invites. It invites. And because of the invitation, redemption, restoration pattern, there's something to celebrate. Our joy should be invested in this invitation, redemption, restoration pattern. This is the work of the kingdom. This is what Christ is here to do, to invite humanity back into a secured, anchored relationship with the Father, which you were made for from the beginning. And yet the Pharisees stand here and say, we don't want that. Not for them. They haven't earned the right. And the sinners have been living a life that says, God, I don't care about you. The Father is standing in between. He's saying, I'm calling you back to repentance, you sinners, you who are defining yourself by things other than God in your lifestyle of whatever you can find. I'm calling you back to me because I love you. You're not defined by that. But he's also looking at the Pharisees and saying, I'm also calling you back to me because you've been defining yourself by other things as well. And your resentment is getting in the way. I was doing spiritual direction. I started this about 4 years ago, sitting with a guy who is simply reflecting back for me, like, where do I see God in your life as you're talking? And so the first question he asked when we started, he said, if Jesus was here right now, what would he say to you? And I was like, oh, that's great. Because number one, Jesus is here right now, but I can't see him, and I really don't feel like I know what he speaks. The thing that came immediately to mind, pardon the shock, asshole. Yeah, do you say that out loud to your spiritual director? And do you say that out loud in front of Jesus? What is going on? But I did. I voiced it, and then I had to sit in that. My heart, my mind put this word in Jesus' mouth about how he sees me in this moment. What does that tell me about how I see me in this moment? Here's my suggestion. For both of these people outside the Father is anchored and secured. I'm waiting for you, I receive you. By the way, if we could have seen the picture much, much better, the two hands, the left hand is highly masculine, very thick, heavy. The right hand is actually very soft, small in comparison. There's a lot of articulation in the painting world. The reason for that is that he's depicting God as both mother and father. Mother's Day. There is this sense of secure, holding, actually gripping and holding up. There is the sense of just full welcoming in, of embrace. There's the sense with the robe of like bird's wings, oversensed, right? That God has made us both and therefore encompasses both masculine and feminine quality. That this is the God who looks for us and invites us in, that is emotionally attached and not just structurally or theologically attached to who we are. So he stands here and he says, I welcome both of you. I actually pursue both of you. The first two parables, I go out and find you. You are the coin. You are the sheep. You are also the prodigal who leaves, saying, I want to find it somewhere else. And for most of us, all of us, you're also the prodigal who stays and says, I'll be determined by my staying. So the question is, where do you land in that? And I'll invite Pete back up. Like, where do you land in that? And again, as I say often, if it's a condemnation piece, if what you are hearing is somehow shame that you are something wrong, that's not Jesus. If what you're hearing is guilt, i.e. that something is stirring in you, in which God is saying, hey, here's a way in which you are not fully with me, the Father, right now, that's great. I'm good with that. Because guilt is something we can act on and change. This is the point of the cross. For those of you who have never come to the cross, my call to you would be to consider that Jesus says you were made for a perfect relationship with the Father, your sin gets in the way, and I have, through my own work, through my own bloodshed, made that possible. For those of you who have come to the cross before, my question is, what is robbing your joy? Are you able to celebrate what is occurring in the kingdom? Can you celebrate yourself and how God is working in you? If you have a tension there, there's something to sit with the Father in. Because that will get in the way of your other relationships. Are you celebrating other people or are you resenting them? Are you angry about who gets to be in the kingdom? The Pharisees, the older son, they're angry that the sinners would somehow get away with it and be welcomed back in. Absurdly missing their own self-righteousness. Do you have that tension in you? Is there somebody that pulls against you in that capacity that you need to let go of and actually join the family unit? We're all lost. There's not one of us who has not been lost. The joy here is that the Father finds. He seeks and he finds. So my call is twofold. As we do worship, I'd invite the prayer team to come up, and if there is something stirring in you in one of these categories that's getting in the way of you taking the Father's posture, Because this is what we're being called to. The Father calls us to stand with him, to see the kingdom the way he sees the kingdom, to welcome and embrace with open arms. Are you struggling as the prodigal son, looking to the world? Are you struggling as the self-righteous prodigal son, looking to your works? What's getting in the way of standing in the posture of the Father and simply welcoming whoever and whatever is in front of you back to the foot of Jesus? If you identify things that come with that, come down for prayer. Sit with the team. Hear this invitation as joy. And then celebrate that we have a God who doesn't reject us the way we often reject ourselves and reject others.